nation, even though they knew that the moment that they did, 5 Arab nations would begin to converge upon them and try to surround them and drive them into the Mediterranean Sea. And by the power of their military and wise counsel and all that, but also I think probably by the providential hand of God, they survived that war and were able to survive and continue on today. And it's really interesting that we base so much of what we know and so much of what we understand in Christianity off of the beliefs of the ancestors of those people from so many years ago. It's hard to believe that the history has played out the way that it has. And I'm grateful. In 1998, I got the opportunity to travel to Israel on a school trip and spend about almost 10 days there, and really changed my life in significant ways and really helped me to understand this book that I've come to love so much, and trying to learn to understand the people who helped to make this book what it is, that God used to write down his words. And so we've been in the Psalms, and we've been staying in the first 8 Psalms. And today we're going to take a look at a theme that pops up in 2 different Psalms right here at the beginning, in Psalm 7 and in Psalm 9. And it relates to this idea that God is the judge of the world. Now, this picture of God can be quite uncomfortable to people and to modern ears today. We're not always sure 100% we like this idea. Modern people, when they hear the idea that God is a judge, I don't know what they picture. If they picture like a nun with a ruler, and like if you giggle in class, you get smacked on the knuckles with the ruler. I don't know if it's just that we don't like the idea of God monitoring our actions. We don't like the idea that our actions have consequences. I don't know if we just don't want to be accountable for our actions. But this idea of God being a judge makes us really uncomfortable. Not only that, but I think it probably also makes us uncomfortable because we don't like the idea that we might end up punished for some of the actions that we have done, especially when many times the actions that we would admit are wrong are actions that profited us in some significant way. They felt good. They gave us something that we wanted, even if it was at the expense of somebody else. And so this whole idea of God being the judge makes God sound mean. It makes God sound harsh and severe and unkind, unloving, and certainly unforgiving. But when you read the Bible, there's really no room within what the biblical writers say that has anything to do with this modern aversion we have to the idea that God is a judge. In fact, Scripture seems to be relieved beyond belief and almost joyous that the God that has embraced them, that has entered into a covenant with them, is a judge. And not just a judge for Israel, but a judge of actually everybody who lives in the entire world. This theme of judge and justice is actually very common both in the Old and the New Testaments. Just if you look up the word judge, forget about the word justice or the word judging or something like that. Just the word judge or judges, it occurs 149 times in the Old Testament and another 77 times in the New Testament. And most of the time when it uses the term judge, it's referring to God as our judge. Basically, the biblical writers gang up on us, and they tell us that this idea of God as a judge is not only the way it really is, but they also look to us and say, it's a really good thing. It's an incredibly good thing that God is our judge. Even, ironically enough, when it's me that is getting crushed or me that is getting punished or put in line by this God who is a judge, it's still a wonderful, wonderful thing that God is this judge. And the reason why is a reason that should be incredibly obvious to us, but for those of us that are in many ways are sheltered from some of the worst effects of human sin, we don't often think about. The reason why it's really good news that God is a judge is because we live in a broken, sinful world. And in this broken, sinful world, with regularity, people who are powerful abuse that power by damaging people who are weaker than them, by taking something from them that they can't stop the powerful from taking away from them. Now, if we lived in a perfect world, we wouldn't need a judge. If we lived in a world that it was even mostly good, if the truth, if what the modern world says is that humanity is mostly good, but we still make some mistakes from time to time, we probably wouldn't need judges a whole lot either. But the truth is, the reality is, not just according to Scripture, but your own eyes tell you. Your own experience tells you. You don't just have to rely upon the Bible for this. Just look around. The world is a very broken, sinful place. It's a place where there is oppression constantly, and not just on a macro level, government oppressing, this group of people punishing and oppressing another group of people, but just on a micro level, like in your family. There's times when fathers oppress their children unfairly. There's times when older siblings oppress younger siblings, and there's times when younger siblings oppress older siblings, and back and forth between relationships. And then also, yes, on the larger macro levels, there is a constant theme in the Bible that we as a world are broken and sinful, and people are being trampled on, and because of that oppression, we need a judge. If we don't have a judge who can give justice, then the universe, the world as we know it, is going to continue to get worse and worse and worse, and one day it will completely implode. Justice is the idea that there's going to be scales that are balanced. So in the one side, you have the pain of one person, and on the other side, you have the pain of another. Well, injustice is when the pain of one person vastly outweighs the pain of another. Justice is when those two scales are brought back into balance again. The reason why that's a good thing is that if you don't have a judge to balance the scales, then each side who is hurt by the other side is going to keep striking back and getting revenge and trying to get even. And we never just get even, right? We get even and we go beyond because we don't want them to come back and hurt us ever again. And so it escalates and it results in more havoc and more destruction. And so a judge steps in to that scenario and he figures out who did the original abusing, who was the original abused. He punishes the abuser, he rescues the abused, and together they come to an agreement so that the offense itself can be done away with. So finally we can just say, stop with the retribution already. Stop with the revenge. Stop with this fighting back. So when we say that God is a judge, what we're saying is not that God is out there watching all of our behavior, looking for something he can crush us on. What we're saying is that God is a check on human sinfulness. God is the one that helps us deal with our offenses while they're relatively small so that they don't continue to escalate in this escalating war of attrition and of retribution, and we end up completely destroying one another. The Bible is incredibly relieved that God is the judge. The Bible teaches and believes that God will one day make all things right. He will balance the scales so that the cycle of revenge can stop and we can live at peace with one another. That's the goal of justice, is peace and harmony. Now, there's two Psalms in the early part of the book of Psalms that really emphasize this theme, and it's ironically on either side of Psalm 8. Which is what we looked at yesterday, Psalm 7 and Psalm 9. Now, Psalms 7 and 9 talk about a lot of stuff, but I want to focus in on this theme of justice. And so I'm going to read for you just a couple of verses from Psalm 7, and then I'll talk about them, and then we'll hit Psalm 9, talk about a couple more verses, and then I'm going to send you on your way. But Psalm 7, verse 8 says this. Psalm 7, verse 8. The Lord judges the peoples. Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness and according to the integrity that is in me. Oh, let the evil of the wicked come to an end, and may you establish the righteous, you who test the mind and hearts, O righteous God. My shield is with God, who saves the upright in heart. Now listen to verse 11. This is an interesting verse. God is a righteous judge and a God who feels indignation every day. I want you to think about that for just a second. What must it be like to be God in an unjust world? where people hurt each other with regularity, both on a small scale, a medium scale, and on a huge, large cosmic scale, where oppression is happening in our homes, in our communities, in our neighborhoods, and in our world. How does it feel like to be God? You know what it feels like to be God? It feels that you're angry all day, every day. You feel indignation. Now, what's indignation? Indignation is what happens when a standard has been violated or an innocent person has been trampled and been damaged and been hurt in some way. Indignation is that sense that you have, that's not right, that's not fair, that shouldn't have happened. God feels that every single day. We don't feel it. Why? Because sometimes we're the ones doing the oppressing, but also because we're shielded from much of the oppression that could be happening to us. But God sees every person who's being oppressed in every situation. Every job offer that is unfairly offered to somebody else, he sees that. Every child who's passed over because somebody didn't like them for some reason. Every person whose life is taken, whose body is damaged by other people and their choices. God sees it. God can't turn away from it. God hears every cry from every oppressed heart. Do you remember the story of God and Cain and Abel? God decided to accept Abel's sacrifice, but not Cain's. So Cain gets angry and he kills his brother. The text tells us God confronts Cain with chilling words. He says, "Your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." Can you imagine what it's like to be God? Can you imagine how many screams he hears every day? How much oppression he has to witness? Yeah, he's a judge. He can't just ignore it. He can't just wink at it. He can't just be the grandfather in heaven and pat everybody on the back and tell them what a great guy or girl they are while they continue to go on their merry way oppressing other people. That's not the God you want. And whether you want him or not, it's not the God who exists. The God who exists is the righteous judge, and he feels indignation every single day. He cannot ignore the cries of the oppressed. And that's a good thing. He would be a moral monster if he could ignore those cries and just go about his business and not care and not balance the scales. But he does care, and he will balance the scales. Jump over to Psalm 9. Let me read a few verses from verses 7 through 12. It says this, "But the Lord sits enthroned forever. He has established his throne." Why? "For justice. And he judges the world with righteousness. He judges the peoples with uprightness. The Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. And those who know your name put their trust in you. For you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you." Now, when he says seek you, what does he mean they're seeking? They're seeking justice. He's talking about the oppressed in verse 9, that they're a stronghold. When they're oppressed, where are they supposed to go? What are they supposed to do? They're supposed to run to Yahweh. They're supposed to run to this God who is their judge, and they're supposed to point back to their oppressor and say, "God, I'm seeking your face." Why? Not just to love you and worship you, that's part of it, but I'm seeking you because I need justice from the people that are oppressing me. And the writer here, Psalm 9, is David. He's like, it's good. God's going to give them what they need. Look at verse 11. "Sing praises to the Lord who sits enthroned in Zion. Tell among the peoples his deeds. For he who avenges blood is mindful of them. He does not forget the cry of the wicked." Friends, this is good news for us. Okay? Our oppression, our pain, our hurt, the ways you've been unfairly treated by other people matters to God. It makes him angry. He wants you to run to him. He wants you to cry out to him for justice, and he wants you to trust him to deal with it, to one day balance the scales. Now, the problem comes, and the psalmist is about to admit that this problem exists. The problem comes in that God doesn't dispense his justice immediately. And certainly, even if it's not immediately, it's not even in my time frame in the way I would like it. Because, you see, when it happens to you, you want justice now, immediately. And anytime you have to wait for justice is incredibly difficult and painful. And I get that, both from personal experience and from interacting with other people who have gone through the same thing. When someone has wronged you, you want it to be fixed immediately. God doesn't always operate according to our timelines. Sometimes God takes a long time. In fact, he acknowledges that very idea right here in Psalm 9, down in verses 17 and 18. He says, the wicked shall return to Sheol. Sheol is like the Old Testament idea of the place of the dead, where the dead go when they die, okay? The wicked shall return to Sheol, to the ground, to the forgotten place. All the nations that forget God. For the needy shall not always be forgotten, and the hope of the poor shall not perish forever. You know what that implies? Is that it feels for a while like the needy are forgotten and the poor are perishing forever. That's what it feels like. Sometimes you don't get the justice you want right away. Sometimes it seems like those who oppress are getting ahead. And yet what the psalmist continually brings us back to is that, you know what? Justice, even though it seems like it takes a long time, justice is inevitable, even if you have to wait for it. He talks about there in verse 17, the wicked shall return to Sheol. You know what that partly means? Death is part of God's punishment for oppression, for sin, right? That's why death entered the world, is because of our sin. So even if you walk through your whole life and nobody ever holds you accountable for what you did, the fact that you die in the end is evidence that your judge is holding you accountable for those actions, for your sin. That's part of it. And the New Testament kind of fills in the gap, adds a little bit more information to this subject, that the judgment is not avoided simply because you made it to die before somebody held you accountable. Even if you die, the scriptures say, there is appointed a judgment after death for your actions in this life. So that your judgment might happen in this world, but it's definitely going to happen in the next. No one ever gets away with anything. The judge is watching, and the judge will repay. This is a thing that is going to happen. Now take a look at the last two verses of Psalm 9, and with this I'll let you go. Verse 19 says, arise, O Yahweh, let not man prevail. Let the nations be judged before you. Put them in fear, O Yahweh. Let the nations know that they are but men. See, this is one of the reasons why we have these verses that describe the coming judgment. Why does God talk about the fact that he's a judge? Why does God warn humanity about the consequences of their actions? Because the warning of impending judgment is meant to be a deterrent to remind us humans that we're not gods, that we are only men, that one day we will be held accountable to a higher authority. And that is meant to check our behavior. So that when I go to oppress somebody, I go, oh shoot, if I do that thing, then God one day is going to hold me accountable and he's going to balance the scales, and it's not going to be so good for me at that point. So maybe I'll hold off on our oppression. You see, I think there's a place for justice, that we can seek justice today, as well as acknowledging that someday God will dispense perfect justice in eternity. Because God's justice in eternity is meant to be a deterrent to injustice today. So we need to be people who know that God is a judge. And that should comfort those of us who are being oppressed, but it also should be a word of warning to us when we take the role of oppressor. When we use our words to wound another person, when we take something from somebody that they didn't want to give to us just because we wanted it, when we act in a selfish and unkind ways, we need to take notice. And we need to remember, we are just men. We are just women. We are just flawed, frail creatures of dust who will one day stand before our judge and our maker. And he'll balance the scales. So why not live a life of justice now? Why not treat people fairly now? So that when I get to the judge, he doesn't have anything to balance. Everything is balanced everything is perfectly the way it's supposed to be. That's our incentive, to be people of righteousness, to be people of justice, to treat people well, treat people kindly. Not just because we're afraid of being crushed for it, but because we want to approach God with confidence and not with fear. And I think these two Psalms, when you read them side by side, really emphasize how important it is that God is a judge, because he'll take care of those who have been oppressed, and then he'll also deal with and balance the scales for those who have been doing the oppressing. So yeah, some of these meditations are not super warm and fuzzy, Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd stuff. But you need to know God is not just your shepherd, God is your judge. It can save you a whole lot of heartache, and it'll also prevent you from damaging other people so that you have to face him as your judge and deal with that later in life. And if you are currently feeling like you have a beef against somebody who's treated you unfairly, be comforted. Be at peace. Your God hears you, he sees, he cares, and he is going to move to give you the justice that you need, whether now or in eternity or both. So there you go, Psalm 7, Psalm 9. I hope that's helpful to you as you meditate and become, hopefully, a little bit more like the God that we read about in these texts. Just a couple of announcements. Number one, next week is our Red Cross blood drive. And we have heard that they will accept walk-ins, but they would much prefer if you go online or give them a call to sign up ahead of time. redcrossblood.org, 1-800-RED-CROSS is the number. We would love to see you here on the 19th to give blood to our community and really meet a need that is just a really pressing one at this time with all the things with the COVID virus. And one last thing, this coming Sunday, 9:30 a.m., I'm going to be back teaching another lesson in how the story ends, talking about the end of the world, end of time, the end of God's story, the end of the Bible, all the things that are still yet to come in the future and how we can get ready for it and how we can prepare for it. And honestly, how to understand where the story is headed, because we really, really need to know that. So that's coming at 9:30, and then of course at 10:45, just like normal, our service will be live streamed for all of you to watch. And we're looking forward in the next few weeks to possibly starting to reopen again, but that's still in development, still in planning. For now, we're sticking with the plan we've been working with these last 8 weeks. I understand the impatience, but we need to take our time and do this right and do it well. So thank you for your time. May the Lord bless you. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I will see you bright and early on Sunday morning.